Okay, and we're all right. So, hello, welcome to the Train Talk podcast. Thank you for listening. Uh, so I'm here.
Hello.
Yeah, I'm
Hi.
here. I'm here with Morgan. We'll probably have more guests later in the future, if because I definitely want to keep doing this podcast. But yeah, as the name suggests, we will be talking about trains, and
Yes.
and basically, I just talk about stories and legends about trains, and people ask me questions. That's pretty much all that happens.
I will be fully honest. I do not know anything about trains, so ask me questions. Talk to my friend.
Yeah, I'm the train guy. I'm usually the person to come to when any train related concerns are brought up, which actually isn't a lot.
I'm I am the ghost person.
Yeah,
This is how we work. I answer questions about spooks, and Zeke answers my questions about trains when I need to know.
yeah. But something I'm gonna get very clear is that trains and locomotives are very different. Especially, I'm just gonna put it on the table right now. Especially Thomas, because it's in the name. Thomas the Tank Engine, not Thomas the Train. So, trains are the things that they pull, locomotives are the things that pull them. So, just getting that cleared up right now. Trains and locomotives are different. But, anyways, before we
It's a
get.
very
Yes?
yes.
Alright. Well, before we get into anything complicated, we're just gonna start with the beginnings of locomotives and railways. Like the beginning of locomotives and then railways. Starting with a very eccentric man who saw a very eccentric man who sought out to build a hold on a very eccentric person in Britain who wanted more than just a horse-drawn carriage. I believe his name was I need to I can't remember his name. Like I still do research on trains. Like that's my general thing. I do research and I do research on trains. Oh, that's his name. Richard Trevithick. Trevithick.
A
Richard
very
Trev.
interesting name.
Well, I
Very.
mean, this was like early United Kingdom in like the 1700s. Late say 1700s. Late 1700s. A man known as Richard Trevithick saw a very was one of the many witnesses to the new type of pumping system that pumped out water from the local mines. A very large steam pump that used steam to push and pull water and pump water out from the mines and in through the cities. Basically, the world's first large sewer system, I guess.
Very dirty or very clean. We shall never know.
And when you first look at the very first steam pump, you would think that doesn't look like it could fit on some wheels and pull some wagons, because it wasn't. Back then, the earliest railways were called tramways, and they were always in the mine. There were several mine carts, as literally everyone calls them. Several mine carts were pushed on these tramways, especially smaller and leaner ones for much smaller people to fit through smaller spaces. Talk about claustrophobia. And Richard Trevithick saw the low pressure steam boiler that the large pump was using and sought to use a smaller but higher pressure boiler to create a much mode of transportation, as the most effective transportation at the time was horse-drawn carriage, which also was super expensive because remember, this is the UK in the late 1700s. So Richard Trevithick saw. began to do some research. And he created his first vehicle that everyone around called the Puffing Devil, because nobody had seen anything like it at the time. It was the most effective mode of transport at the time was walking through muddy streets, and sometimes cobblestone if you're lucky. So when the Puffing Devil made it to a pub, Mr. Trevithick went into the pub to get a drink. However, he made one fatal mistake. He left the fire running, which built up too much steam, and while he was drinking, the boiler burst.
And well, talk about haunted.
Actually, no. He just forgot to douse the fire, which is very important. Because if you don't douse the fire in anything steam related, or if you don't douse the heat or stop the heat, it could build up too much pressure, and with no sort of pressure release valve, it builds up and builds up and builds up until the metal outer shell can't hold anymore, and we'll get into
big explosion.
I just want to say, yes, it's an explosion, but it's not the kind of explosion you expect. I don't think I've ever witnessed a boiler explosion, but there are two types. We'll get into it more in depth with more analyzation of steam engines later. But engines like this, steam engines, if they build up too much pressure, either two things can happen. Either one, the boiler bursts in general, sending heat pipes literally in every direction. Or it could be a much more dangerous fire where the crown sheet on the firebox, which we'll get into later, the crown sheet on the firebox melts, and causing a large air pocket to blast steam straight out through the firebox, which, if you know anything about steam, it is super hot and scalding. It is scalding hot, which I'm pretty sure, and I'm pretty sure I've heard before, is pretty bad for human skin. Like I said, we'll get into that later, especially with later incidences with steam engines, but for now, Richard Trevithick did not give up, and we have him to thank for the later iterations of locomotives and trains and that kind of transport later down the line. No pun intended. Anyways.
Should have made it a pun.
Yeah.
Best pun of all.
It's a pun that's been used way too much.
You can never use a pun too much.
You say that. You might not be able to use a pun too much, but you can certainly outweigh a joke.
Yes.
Anyways, like I said, Richard.
Back to trains.
Yeah, Richard Trevithick did not give up, and thus he created the very first allegedly, at least from my standpoint, allegedly very first steam-powered road vehicle that was successful, with the very first London bus. Of course, in Britain, it was very ornate, and instead of having a horse attached to the front, instead had a boiler underneath the carriage and a very small firebox. It still created enough steam to get it moving, albeit at a very slow speed, though this is the 1700s, so a very slow speed now would be very, very ridiculously fast back then. And trust me, we will get into that in this episode. But it was a success. And it was so successful that even Chris Barry, a man who I actually researched trains from, actually rode and drove it. And of course, it had 3 wheels, which now, with cars like the Reliant Robin, which has 1 wheel in the front, would have been completely stupid. But at least it didn't go at ridiculous speeds. But still, it was very, very impressive. A very, very, very big feat in the world of steam power.
Mm.
Fast forward a few more years, and 1802 arrived. This was the dawn of the very first steam-powered locomotive. Richard Trevithick built up a steam engine with two large heat pipes that channeled the heat into the boiler and created lots and lots of steam. It powered pistons, which powered 12 million cogs. I mean, I'm being dead serious. If you look up an image of the Richard Trevithick engine, it is ridiculous how many cogs are on there. Enough to give Bendy a run for his money. But it was also a success. So successful, in fact, that industries all over Britain were buying them, specifically mining industries, and they worked on tramways quite well. However, the rails didn't work too well, especially since they were made of cast iron. So if you went over a small gradient, it would crack underneath the immense weight of the steam engine. Eventually this problem was fixed, however, but soon another problem arose. With a new engine, I believe called Locomotion 1, by a certain George Stephenson, who will be very important later on, had created a new railway, which had just opened, with its own passenger carriage, known as the Experimental. I believe that was its name. It didn't have suspension, so it must have been a very uncomfortable ride.
Well, bumpy as ever.
Very bumpy, especially in the early 1800s. Those tracks on uneven ground just sounds awful.
How many speed bumps can you compare it to? Like out of all the speed bumps you can think of.
Like on a single row of track with uneven ground, that would be like one. Like for a small bit, it would be like riding on 20 speed bumps.
Ah, jeez.
Yeah, it's not exactly comfortable. But trains now have suspension that prevent stuff like that from happening.
That seems good.
Yeah. But another problem arose. Although it could carry quite a few... What?
Uh-oh.
Although the steam engine could carry several... Although a steam engine could carry loads and loads of material of ore, coal, stone, you name it, the steam engines weren't in commercial service now. Still weren't in commercial service, which means they weren't in operation. There weren't steam engines all over the country, everywhere, that earned up enough money. They did work in the mines, but those were tramways, so there wasn't a revenue-earning service railway. But the biggest problem was some industries were still using horses to drag their large and cumbersome wagons filled with ore across the line. And since there was no set timetable, this constantly arose problems, with both sides either electing to push one back or refusing to move at all. And you can see why this was such a problem. That was until the Rainhill Trials. To anyone who isn't a rail fan, which is probably quite a few, to anyone who isn't a rail fan, this may sound like just something completely random. But it was actually the most important event in railway history. The Rainhill Trials actually made it so that railways were a thing. I believe 4 locomotives were tried. 4 or 3 locomotives were tried. One locomotive being one of the original designs, with several pistons on top. The much lighter weight engine that was built specifically for speed, named Sans-Pareil, and another engine built in secret. Another engine built by a certain George Stephenson, and one built just in time with all the proper tests. An engine that's name shall ring out throughout history. An engine known as the Rocket. Personally, I don't understand why the name is the Rocket. Because I can understand if there was an engine called Rocket when NASA was occurring, but in the early 1800s, I have no idea. But the rocket had passed all the tests. Its pistons were angled in such a way that it could still. Its pistons were angled in such a way that it wouldn't stick, and it had one massive driving wheel, which granted it enough pulling power, which granted it a higher tractive effort and speed, in which eventually rang true for later locomotives down the line. Down the line. Oh, and Morgan, you're muted. Is everything okay? Alright. Of course. Okay, well. Anyways, on to the Rainhill trials. The first locomotive seemed to be okay, but they did have several teething troubles. Well, not teething troubles, but they had several flaws, especially with the first engine that had an older design. As it rolled down the line, it created too much steam. I don't remember exactly what happened, but that engine failed pretty badly. And the lighter weight Sonpareil seemed to be perfect. However, it started suffering problems, but after its first repair, it just came down. It all came down as the water tube feeding water into the boiler had burst. So Sonpareil was now out of the race. But the other locomotive that didn't break down, the Rocket. And most embarrassingly, whenever the other engines broke down, the Rocket was sent out to please the crowds. And the Rocket was so well designed, it could carry 2 times its weight, 3 times. It could carry more than its weight for extreme distances. And it managed to reach, I believe, 30 or 35 miles an hour, which was absolutely nuts back then. The Rocket was quite the success. Many people today might believe that, the Rocket was the first locomotive built, which isn't true. The Rocket proved its might because it was properly tested. The Rocket proved its might because it was properly tested and ran smoothly. And after the Rainhill trials, George Stephenson, the man who made the Rocket, proposed an idea to build a railway that beat the canals. Of course, there were many concerns. However, after creating a design that managed to work, George Stephenson's idea of building a railway started to come to fruition by putting drainage pipes into the mud. By putting drainage pipes on either side of the mud, laying down several planks of wood, adding grass on top, and then laying the rails. And thus the railway was finally completed, and it carried did carry passengers, especially, I believe it also carried several royal members. Yeah, royal members. I'll just say royal members. However, one day, which I only learned this from Chris Berry's explanation. So I obviously learned these. I didn't come up with these off the top of my head. But apparently one death had actually occurred on the railway, with one man trying to run away from the oncoming rocket. Falling over possibly, and getting his legs severed by the wheel. However, this did not stop the railways from growing, as you can tell with railroads in America, such as the CSX, not sponsored, and other railways in Britain, and especially with the several abundant locomotives and shows about locomotives that there are. Anyways, Morgan, do you have any questions? Alright. So I think with that, we can finally end this. We can finally end the first episode of Train Talk. Obviously, we will try to have more guests. But yeah, feel free to tune in for more episodes of Train Talk when they come out. And yeah. So thank you for tuning in. And yeah, this is Zeke signing off.